hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Nebraska's Farm Bureau Inside Profitability. I am Jay Rempe. I'm Senior Economist with Nebraska Farm Bureau, and I'm hosting today's event. If you're not familiar with our Inside Profitability series, it's a series of webinars and podcasts and other events that focus on producer profitability. And the topics that we feature are identified by our members as ones that are key to managing and maintaining an economically viable farm and ranch. And we certainly hope the information provided through the series is of value and helps you in managing your farm and ranch. And I'll put in a bit of a plug here. If you have some ideas, some thoughts on issues that you'd like to learn more about, please let me know at jayr@nefb.org. We're always looking for ideas to feature in our series of webinars here. Today, we're going to return to the topic of drought. We've had a few episodes already on drought issues related to crop insurance and water management. But today we're going to tackle the topic specifically of the creation of the drought monitor and the information and data that goes into the development of the drought monitor. And we've received a lot of questions about what kinds of information, what kind of data, how is the drought monitor created and the maps created. So to help us with that today, we have Dr. Mark Svoboda of UNL Drought Mitigation Center. Dr. Svoboda, or Mark, has been with the Drought Mitigation Center since it started in 1995 and has been one of the authors and the creators of the Drought Monitor since it was started in 1999. And not surprisingly, his areas of research interest include drought monitoring, drought early warning systems, drought indicators, and water resource issues and development of tools. So he is a drought expert, and we're happy to have him with us today. So Mark, thank you very much for joining us today. We certainly appreciate your willingness to take the time and talk to us a little bit about the drought monitor, all the information and data that goes into it. So I'll turn it over to you, Mark, and let you share some things with us.
All right. Thank you very much, Jay. Appreciate the invitation by the Nebraska Farm Bureau to talk to you today about the drought monitor. We're going to talk a little bit about, what it is, what it isn't, and maybe give you a better feel for just what does go into the drought monitor. In other words, what's behind the green curtain. So, drought monitoring in the past has been pretty one-sided. And by that, I mean, there haven't been a lot of tools until recent times. So we started off, if you look at this old vintage map of drought areas back from the Dust Bowl years, this was just hand-drawn, pretty much based on, at that time, the Weather Bureau was within the U.S. Department of Agriculture before it moved into the separate National Weather Service within NOAA. So this might have been something you would have seen back in the day, as they say. Fast forward a few decades, still pretty coarse resolution products we were using to monitor drought. This was the main trigger map by USDA throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, and that was the Palmer Drought Severity Index. But notice the delineation of these large areas here, the Sandhills region. States are divided into what's called climate divisions. This also mirrors crop reporting districts for many of the states east of the Rockies. So it's still, at that time, very coarse resolution, but based on a lot of different, climate data that went into those climate divisions. Now, that's when the drought monitor came around, was in 1999. Not sort of coincidentally, I should say, there was a big drought out in the northeast part in the Washington, D.C. area that caught the attention of policymakers and congressional folks. And we started our map experimentally in May of 99 and went operational in August of 99. So obviously they were very interested in this product from day one. That might be the fastest experimental product in the history of government products. So that became sort of the gold star, which leads us to the map as you see it more or less today, updated weekly, covering the United States, covering Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, also the U.S. Virgin Islands and the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands. So this thing has really expanded over the last 20 plus years from when I first started back in 99. So we're going to talk about the process. What does that exactly mean? How do we put that into perspective? Actually, the nuts and bolts of how we make the map each week, the authors. And then what can you do to perhaps have a voice in that process? Because This is a pretty transparent process. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we'll go through this and would welcome any feedback after through the Nebraska Farm Bureau or directly to me. My email will be at the end of the presentation. So I think it's important to note that this is a three-way partnership. It's not just the National Drought Mitigation Center, and that N does stand for national, not just the Nebraska Drought Center. We work with the U.S. Department of Ag, and we work with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They're the home of the National Weather Service people. So they have field offices in every state, service centers in every state in the case of USDA. And we're working closely, and I'll show a little bit of that demographic of who we are working with. First used in 2002, 2003 as a trigger, and then written into the farm bills from 2008 onward, including becoming the U.S. Department of Ag Secretary, becoming a fast track designation tool for the Secretary of Ag. But there's others using it. Internal Revenue Service for tax deferrals for say, livestock on drought years. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. EPA, several states, many states, most every state, in fact, uses it as one form of informing their governor of drought conditions, along with some other tools, and many, many more. So a couple things. One is the drought monitor is not a forecast. So I won't read all this verbatim, but I want to touch on especially the top part of this slide, because I'll get into some of the other stuff later on at the bottom of the slide. It's a snapshot of current conditions, updated weekly, looking at many time periods, both on the short term, say less than 6 months or more seasonal, all the way out to 5-6 years and everywhere in between. So we look at the last 1 day to the last 5-6 years. So again, not a forecast. It's not a model. We're going to show you examples of many of the data inputs we use. And it's not just based on precipitation. So there's a lot that goes into it. And then there's a whole nother world of how we validate the product to make sure we're putting out as accurate a map as we can. And I'll go into that in more detail as well. So the process is an author takes all these data layers, brings them into the computer system, which we call a Geographic Information System, or GIS. And that allows us to overlay these maps georeferenced across the United States and Alaska, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands and U.S. Virgin Islands. And then in addition to the objective science, we also look at impact reports, which come from a variety of mediums. We develop draft maps that go out to around 450 plus people on the ground in every state for ground truthing, sort of a quick sanity check, if you will. That's that local expert feedback network I spoke of, and I'll show you a map of that demographic here. And then the map's released on Thursday morning. Now, keep in mind that the data cutoff is Tuesday morning. So around 7 a.m. Central Time, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, we release the map on Thursdays, and the data cutoff is 7 a.m. on Tuesday morning. So if it rains Tuesday evening, Tuesday night, or Wednesday, that will be captured on next week's map. So I mentioned this group of 450 experts around the country. You can see Nebraska is well represented with 30 members, including a state drought task force group that comes up with recommendations for the authors. So this involves the Weather Service people, the USDA people, the state agency people, University Extension. Groups like that are providing input into recommendations for the national author that week. That, as you can see, Nebraska, compared to other states, I mean, even more than Texas, for example, Nebraska has the largest amount of participants. So that's very, and of course, some of that's we're here too, but we're really involving a network of state experts, not just at the drought centers. So these folks cover the state in all directions and provide excellent feedback, and they discuss impacts, they discuss what extension's hearing on the ground, what the service centers are hearing on the ground, et cetera. So a big part of the U.S. Drought Monitor map is what we call a convergence of evidence approach. Exactly what do we mean by that? So we have many, many inputs, dozens of inputs. And so they all tell their own story. How do we combine them to tell the overall story? So it's a big challenge. You're covering 50 states in less than 3 days. Just do the math on that. And these authors put in about 40 hours in the course of 2.5 days, maybe 3 days. So it's a heavy lift. They do it on a 2-week rotation. And that's about the most people can handle without burning out. So they're bringing in all the physical data I touched on earlier, and I'll show you examples of that here in a couple slides. They're also trying to bring in the drought impacts, which is down here in the blue. And in the green, we have that local expert network. So you can see the overlap in this Venn diagram approach where these really 3 efforts work in concert together to inform the author to make the most accurate map that they can. So what does it mean? What does that D0 versus a D4 mean? So D4 is the worst, right? That's the exceptional drought category, something that is in the 1st to 2nd percentile that we only expect to see every once in, say, 50 to 100 years. Now, just like floods, you're probably familiar with that flood language of a return period. That's a 1 in 100-year flood or a 1 in 50-year flood. Well, this is kind of the same concept. And yes, you can have a 1 in 50-year flood and within a weeks of each other, months, or the next year. It doesn't mean it's only going to happen one time in 50 years. And things have been really crazy out there, if you haven't noticed, on the climate roller coaster these days. So drought is kind of behaving the same way. D1 is our first mention of drought. That's the 11th to 20th percentile. I'm going to show you a figure on the upcoming slide that hopefully gives a better visual presentation. But that's once in 5 to 10 years. D2 once in, say, 10 to 20, and D3 once in 20 to 50. What this does is it helps us put this in historical perspective. I could give you a value of a stream flow level, a groundwater level, a drought index, a satellite, a model, but I need to understand how often that value occurs. That gives me that historical likelihood, like I said. So let's look at it this way. If I have 100 years of data, and I'm looking at a given week or a given month, these raindrops each represent 1 year. So on the wet cycle, for this particular location, let's say it's Lincoln, my 2 wettest years were back in 1941 and 1957. If I come down to the 2 driest years, 1950 and 2020 were my 2 driest. So that would be your D4. And if I go to the next 3, which falls into the lowest or driest 5 years, and that could be for any of the inputs, right? We look at each input and we rank each input individually. And then we try to bring them into the map. So I mentioned stream flow, groundwater, soil moisture, precipitation, temperature, etc. All parts of the water cycle. We rank them individually first. So my next 3 is now over here in my table on the bottom left. Remember, D3 is 3 to 5 percentile, my 5 lowest occurrences or driest or hottest. And conversely, my wettest are up here. So the point is here, we don't even think drought until we're down. Here you can see the D2. And so now I've captured the 10 lowest incidents or driest incidents. These yellow dots represent the abnormally dry periods. So that isn't even a drought category. That's the 30th percentile. So in 100 years of data, only my driest 30 would even make the yellow class. And I don't even talk about drought until I get to D1, which is the 20th percentile. So we're trying to capture the more rare events. We're not just capturing dryness that you might see every summer, every season. We're trying to really sort of separate the wheat from the chaff here. We're trying to really zoom in on these more rare droughts if we can, right? So that's the last, say, 30 lowest, driest events for each indicator. So now let's focus on how we make it. So I mentioned it's a partnership. We have 3 authors here at the Drought Center. We have 1 out in Reno, Nevada for the West at the Desert Research Institute. We have 1 author at U.S. Department of Ag. And then we have 4 authors between Washington, D.C. and Asheville, North Carolina for NOAA. So they rotate, they do about a 2-week shift, and then it transitions to the next author. They communicate on their own listserv, and they share what they got to, why they did what they did, and that transition notes go to the next author to give some continuity to it. So I mentioned we're trying to capture all these different data inputs, and these are some of the parameters, I mentioned we're trying to capture in the hydrologic cycle. Rain as it comes out of the sky is just one part of the equation. How much of that makes it into the soil? How much of that gets into groundwater and releases into streams or reservoirs? And then, particularly with interest to agriculture, what's the stress on vegetation? And for livestock producers, what sort of forage is going to be out there? So we're trying to capture all of these elements, and not just rain and snow. So this just gives you a look and feel for many of those inputs, right? Different drought indicators, including hydrologic over here on the right side, streams and reservoirs and soil moisture. What do we use? We call remote sensing. What satellite products do we use? What local input can we get from each of the 50 states and the islands? And particularly in the West, which is in a huge drought this year as well, what sort of snow did they get? What sort of water content is in that snow? And how is that going to release out? Quickly with high temperatures, all the fire issues you've seen, that's led to, over the years, starting with about 5 indicators to now about 40 to 50 indicators that an author has to look at, again, for 50 states and more in the course of just 2.5, 3 days. So there's been a new breed of tools. I'm going to cover a couple slides here in the last decade or so, really born out of the 2012 flash drought. That was a very rapid onset, intensifying drought that affected the entire midsection of the country, from Nebraska all the way over into the Ohio and Tennessee valleys, and down to Texas and up to the Great Lakes. So it was a really large drought. Soil moisture recharge was pretty good in the off season, winter into spring. Planting all looked pretty good. And then between May and the end of June, the bottom fell out and the spigot turned off. So out of that, there was a lot of new tools developed to try to capture these rapid onset droughts, or what we call flash droughts. And the University of Nebraska and the National Drought Mitigation Center have developed several of these tools and partnered with others, including NASA and USGS and NOAA, to develop these tools over the years, along with others that we have not developed, but we certainly use. So we're open to using any tool that we can evaluate to make sure that it makes sense and does a good job of portraying conditions on the ground. So this just is, let me just run through a few examples. Here's a radar derived precipitation, very high resolution, right? We're down to, pretty much sub-county field level type of resolution. We look at point data as well. In this case, this is USGS streamflow data. 1 month of a drought indicator based on point data, again, in situ data from actual stations collecting the data. And that black circle just lets you know, as you flip through these, for any location in any of the 50 states, you can start to see how many of these indicators are telling the same story. Again, back to that convergence of evidence approach. So this is a 30-day period, but we can look at water year, calendar year, multiple years, multiple months, multiple weeks. So it's not just one time frame either. And we can see, is this a short-term drought? Is it a long-term drought? Is it both? Maybe it's getting better in the short term, but long-term, we still have no stream flow or low groundwater. So you don't want to cry wolf too early, and you don't want to call off drought too soon as well, right? Because a lot of the programs are tied to that. So we're cognizant of that. We're always having that in mind, but for us, it's really about the data driving the map, right? It's not the policy driving the map, it's the data. And we built the science first, and then the policy came later, as I'll explain a little bit later. So again, 2 years, vegetation health. This looks at satellite based on vegetation health is looking at satellite conditions of vegetation. This is for evapotranspiration, which also is going to play a role on forage and row crops and even forests. evaporative stress, another evapotranspiration-based product, and groundwater, both from in situ values from USGS, but also from satellite from the NASA product called GRACE. So we're looking at the red zone, we're looking at the total soil column, and in all it's 150 maps. So I'll spare you showing you all 150, but suffice it to say, you know, we're looking at just about everything out there we can get our hands on, and we're bringing it into the computer system so that we can overlay those squiggly lines in the background. There are the drought monitor vectors. So we can see, did it rain last week within that drought area, or did it stay dry? And if it stayed dry, did it stay dry enough to make it get worse that particular week? Some new products, as we like to call the new breed of products, we've developed right here at the Drought Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Short-term and long-term blends are now at much higher resolution. We're down to, say, in that 10 kilometer for every pixel. So across the United States, for a national product, that's very high resolution. We're not claiming field scale at that point, but we're capturing the general trends. It's always possible you're going to be under a thunderstorm. Hit or miss nature of thunderstorms is such that that can cause these sort of the case of the measles on the maps, or chickenpox, if you will. But when you look at longer time periods, that tends to blend out and tends to smooth out the story. We're also releasing this fall, probably in about a couple weeks now, a new flash drought blend that really picks up on quick onset of droughts. Most of the time, droughts were thought of only as really slow onset disasters. And we do know, again, learning through this process over the last 2 decades, that these things can come on a matter of just a few days or a few weeks. And if that's at the wrong time for a particular phenological cycle of corn or beans or cool or warm season grasses, it will definitely have a major impact potentially on yield. So these are new tools to help to try to address that. And then one of our more popular products, and I'm going to show you a slide that says what's out there besides just the map each week, looking at the change map of how things got better or worse from last week, the last month, last year. You can look at a whole lot of different time periods. And that's this slide right here. So the change maps I was just showing you, but there's a lot of other stuff. If you go to the Drought Monitor's website, you'll notice across the top a navigation bar. I would encourage you to check those out, including the tutorials about what it is and what it isn't, a little bit more detail than I can give you today in a short presentation. Another popular one is the time series. All the raw data is there down to the county scale. You can download that freely. You can download the GIS data if you're into that. And we've developed through USDA's Farm Service Agency the eligibility tool that triggers livestock forage disaster program. Okay, let me wrap up by getting into maybe where you could see the transparency or see where you could get involved in this process. So this on the left are some of the key milestones for when the Drought Monitor, again, the science before the policy, but they came in and said, let's look at this. The actuarial scientists came in from those agencies and said, we're going to take a look at your database. We provided the full database for them to evaluate. And they came up with these programs that are triggered off of the Drought Monitor here on the left. The first instance being off of the 2002 drought, which was pretty bad in western Nebraska as well. A drier year than even most of the years in the Dust Bowl years, if you look at just a 1-year period. Obviously not for a decade. Dried milk not fit for human consumption was distributed to ranchers and folks for livestock to supplement feed. Then the big next major milestone was in 2008 when this was brought into the Farm Bill, at first for the livestock forage disaster program, and then in 2012 for the Secretarial Fast Track Disaster Program. I've included the URL link here. You can go and take a look at all the programs that are tied to it, which basically is going to take you to this information. Several now, about a half dozen almost now, of the programs are tied directly to the Drought Monitor in some form or fashion. They have adjusted those over each of the last 3 farm bills, and my guess is they'll adjust it maybe again in the next farm bill, which is right around the corner. We'll see. We don't make that call again, which is fine. We want to be removed objectively from the policy or the politics of it. We just want to keep trying to make a better map. And that's what our focus is on. And more information here just on that fast track process, which was a big one because it used to take months, right? And I'm sure many of you listening to this will know back in the 80s and 90s, before the drought monitor was used as a trigger, you may not see a check or see a response to your impacts for several months or a year after the drought was there. So we've sped that up a lot. That's typically now down to a matter of weeks once you're eligible. Now, over the last a little over 10 years plus now, that number needs to be updated. It's about 9.4 billion now, as more of 2021 and into 2022 has been calculated. Payouts have been tied to the livestock forage program alone through the Farm Bill, using the drought monitor as a trigger. 2012, as you remember, and I mentioned earlier, the big one. But we're seeing a spike this year too. So that number is probably going to leap up over 10 billion pretty easily by the end of 2022. This is the breakdown by state in millions. Nebraska ranchers have come in with the fourth highest total, behind Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, for LFP payments at $595 million in total between the period 2008 and 21. And that does not include this year. So again, you can see the distribution of those payments through LFP, through the Farm Service Agency, being tied directly to the drought monitor. So it has a big impact. So again, our objective is to make the science as best we can. So just a couple more slides and I'll wrap it up. Here's where you can go to enter in how you're being impacted. This is a way to get your voice out there for us to see the impacts along with the physical data that we look at. We maintain a drought impact landing page here under droughtimpacts.unl.edu. And there's a few tools here, but I would say focus on condition monitoring observation reports, or CMOR. That's one of them. The other one, of course, we scrub every day, the Twitter feed. What are people tweeting out there about drought and how it impacts them? Each year now, we've been encouraging a hashtag drought and the year that started, I think, with hashtag drought 2017 and has been sort of a grassroots effort every year since. So next year will be hashtag drought 2023. But this is one way to get out there, and anytime drought's mentioned in a tweet, we're going to find it and scrub it using machine learning with computers, and we capture that and put it into a database. So that's one way. The other way is through this condition monitoring observation report database and viewer. This is people coming in and just clicking on a few things where they are, not down to the farm scale, but maybe down to a state county level. How are they being impacted? Here they can upload a photo. This is an example of a report and in New Mexico. And this week's photo, this one is from Georgia. Again, this was from May of this year. I just pulled out an example. As we got into June, July, and August, though, you'll see a lot more reports started coming in here. You can see the drought area here as that spread up and became more intense in Nebraska, the Dakotas, and even over into Iowa and Missouri and Arkansas. So I would encourage you to use this tool. This is something else the authors, we bring this stuff, as you can see right here, each of the reports each week is brought right into where the drought monitor layers are. And if we see some dots in a wide area, we can ask ourselves, okay, what's going on there? Maybe it's been recent heavy rains, but the long-term drought is still there, things of that nature. And there's just a blow up a little tighter picture of it, an example here for you to see it. And we've been collecting that data in more recent times, and we'll continue to build on that going forward, and would encourage you again to come to the Drought Center's website for impacts and participate in the CMOR tool. This is just an example as you start to drill down into a county. You can see Missouri had a lot of participants, as did Arkansas. And if it gets in there, then we're going to capture it. They can tell us when's the last time you saw it. Well, they would say 2011. They kind of give some information. And again, if they have a photo, they can upload that. So just go to this URL right here on submitting a condition monitoring report for drought impacts, and it will come right into the Drought Center's database in real time. and you'll see that dot up there right away, like maybe the next day. Usually it might even be more quicker than that, but it suffices to say it's pretty fast.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time today. This is a fascinating topic, and I think there's a lot of interest in it right now. And thank you for all your work and your colleagues at the National Drought Mitigation Center, because there's a lot of information that I know we as an organization and our members use. So we appreciate you taking the time today. And as Mark put his contact information there, and if anybody wants to follow up with Mark on any questions or any thoughts, I'm sure he'd be happy to visit with you a little bit. So thank you very much, Mark. And